Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you all? Good, good. My name is Jelani Cobb, and I have the honor of being the Dean of Columbia Journalism School. And I'm very, very excited to welcome all of you here today for day one of the FaultLines Democracy Conference. To tell you a little bit about how this came about, and because I'm a historian as well as a journalist, I'll give a bit of historical context. In 1952, a 37-year-old California member of the California State Assembly by the name of John Moss ran for a congressional seat. In and of itself, there's nothing particularly noteworthy about this. He had, up to this point, been mainly identified with his interests in consumer affairs and consumer protection issues. But as he watched what was happening in the country in the early 1950s, he grew increasingly alarmed by the rise of a demagogic figure by the name of Joseph McCarthy. And Joseph McCarthy, who was elected to the Senate, or was appointed to the Senate as part of a special, and then elected as part of a special election, subsequently had recognized a way to utilize the mood of the country, to manipulate the mood of the country to his own ends. And he was greatly aided and facilitated in doing this by the growing, and at this point, almost sprawling national infrastructure for secrecy in the midst of the Cold War. And Assemblyman Moss, in his district, which was in and around Sacramento, recognized that there was a particular dynamic with McCarthy, that he would say something outlandish or he'd say something outrageous, and when people would want, or when members of the media would want to get verification or proof of what he said, he would respond by saying, I would show you, but that's classified. Or, that information is top secret. If I give you any more details, I'll be violating the law, the federal law. And so Assemblyman Moss ran for Congress and was elected in 1952 and began what would be a 13-year quest to get the passage of a government transparency law. He thought that if the government was forced to provide the maximum amount of information to the public, it would forestall the ability of future demagogic figures to manipulate the national mood and thereby damage democracy. And so the story of this legislation eventually kind of goes through the paths that you see in kind of American political political processes. And by 1966, he is able to get this bill shepherded through Congress with the support of a Republican fellow congressman by the name of Donald Rumsfeld. And in 1966, on the 4th of July, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed what has come to be known as the Freedom of Information Act into law. I highlight that story to point out the relationship between FOIA, which every one of our students becomes familiar with every journalist in the country becomes familiar with early in their career, which most or very many American historians become familiar with early in their work, as a cornerstone of government transparency. And it becomes useful for all sorts of reasons, but it comes out of a moment of profound democratic crisis. And to a great extent, our ethics and our operating procedures and our understanding of our field as journalists is influenced and impacted by the lessons we have learned in moments, specifically moments of democratic crisis. We could say that about the Pentagon Papers, we could say that about Watergate, and that in each of those moments, we've refined what we understood journalism to be and what our responsibilities are, not only to the public, but to the democracy that public is expecting us to help uphold. I don't think that it's an exaggeration to say that we're currently in a moment of democratic crisis. And in looking at these precedents, I thought that it was important for us at Columbia Journalism School, as well as stakeholders of various communities and backgrounds, to think about the nature of the current crisis and what are the ethical and practical concerns that we should take, the ethical and practical lessons that we should take from this particular moment. And that is what FaultLines democracy is for. That is why we're having this gathering. That is why we are here today. We are fortunate to have with us President Lee C. Bollinger, who will give welcoming remarks. And President Bollinger, if you don't already know this, I feel like many of us know these things already, but he is a First Amendment lawyer who has been a thought partner on this crucial issue. And we celebrated his scholarship here in Pulitzer Hall last week with a symposium on resilience in journalism and free speech in the age of social media. And we are fortunate to have a president whose work, not only as a president of the university, but whose scholarly contributions have unabashedly and arguably been in defense of democracy itself. So please welcome President Lee C. Bollinger.
Thank you very much, Jelani. I am about at the end of my term as president, my career as president, after 21 years, and one of the things I feel really, really confident about now is giving welcoming remarks. I am really, I am outstanding at giving welcoming remarks. So thank you. So just a couple of comments by way of introducing this obviously very important conference. As the press has undergone some of the worst attacks by government and the private sphere in the last several years, I have always felt that journalism, or the press, is the first line of defense before the university. Journalism and the academy are engaged in the same enterprise, serving the public interest by reporting the truth about our world, done according to very strict and stringent norms of reasoning and objectivity. Always recognizing that these values of truth and nonpartisanship and so on are open to being contested. So when you think about the press, I urge you also to think about universities and the roles they play in a democracy. Second, from my perspective, as a constitutional law scholar and especially a First Amendment scholar, I would suggest that an important topic for thought and discussion is the role of the freedom of press clause in the First Amendment. Beginning in the 1970s, a slim majority of the Supreme Court decided not to give the clause separate meaning apart from the free speech clause. In doing so, the court declined to give constitutional protections to press activities like news gathering and access to government information, a counterpart of FOIA. It also now has a critical significance in whether the structure around the publication of classified information, which was established in the famous Pentagon Papers decision, also of the 1970s, will continue into the future. The internet, as we all know, has had a profound effect on the press, as we knew it throughout the last century, on its business viability and so on. And one area where it has especially had an effect is on making it more problematic to define exactly who is the press. If one says that it is just too problematic to do this, then I predict that Pentagon Papers will collapse, because the prospect of allowing anyone, including those acting without journalistic norms, to have a right to publish classified materials, that's unacceptable. But all this makes the issue or problem of thinking about a category of activity within a democratic society as constituting the press makes it all the more critical. I've written about this, but I would also note that Floyd Abrams is undertaking an initiative to see whether the press clause might be revived and what that would entail, and I really applaud that. The last thing I would note is just how singular, unique Columbia is in research, education, and active engagement in the area of journalism and the press, and of course, democracy. Of course, one starts right here at the journalism school, the only journalism school in the Ivy League, and the greatest in the world. There are also experts on the press, journalism, freedom of the press, free speech, all over the university. In law, public policy, and international affairs, in arts and sciences, in engineering, and beyond. And there are major initiatives to take up particular themes. Of course, we have the Columbia Journalism Review, which I supported when it was going through a very difficult period. I'm glad to see it thriving. But we have the Knight Institute of the First Amendment, a unique collaboration between a great university and an institute dedicated to research and action, litigation, on behalf of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and press. Other parts of Columbia that contribute to this is an initiative called Columbia Global Freedom of Expression, which works on international issues of free speech and press, including training of judges and jurists, building a database of judicial decisions all over the world on free speech and free press, forming a network of people who care about this, and so on. We also have the Brown Institute, Columbia Global Reports, that is edited and run by Nick Lemon, reporting on areas of global issues not generally covered by the press. There is, in other words, no university more suited to hosting this meeting than Columbia and our School of Journalism. Thank you very much for being part of it.
I'm happy to introduce our first panel of the day. We have with us to moderate the first panel of the day, which is America 2030. And starting from my immediate left, we have Adam Serwer of The Atlantic, who's going to moderate. Who's also an alum of Columbia Journalism School. Annette Gordon-Reed, the historian of Harvard University. Robert Kagan, the scholar of the Brookings Institution. Kathy Roberts Forde, the author and historian of University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Jeff Chang, the journalist and probably the person I've known longest up here on this panel. And my fellow Columbia University colleague, Olatunde Johnson, who is a faculty member at the law school. And so thank you. You can welcome them.
Thank you, Jelani, and thank you to all of you for coming. I'm going to start off with some general questions, and then to the extent we have time left, I'm going to ask folks some individual things. But the first thing I'm going to start off with is I'm actually going to question the premise of the event. After the 2022 midterms, we saw Democrats keep the Senate and Republicans win the House. There was not a lot of election denialism, which is something that people were very concerned about. Despite predictions of a red wave, Republicans generally accepted that the political landscape had changed and that the election was not rigged, something that you had heard previously, both in 2020 and in some of the elections that had followed. Has the fever passed and the danger with it?
No.
Why do you say that?
Do I need this?
Yeah, please.
I have a very loud voice, so.
Is that better? Is that good? No, I think that my problem with 2030 is I don't know how we get past 2024. I actually think that we face the real prospect of the dissolution of the country as a result of what's going to happen in 2024. So I don't know how that gets resolved by 2030. But I can sort of run through that if you want me to. But I really do think that we can see that the Trump movement is still entirely dedicated to Trump and still controls and increasingly controls the Republican Party. So if and when Trump declares that he was again fraudulently deprived of his victory in 2024, he will not only have the entire Trump movement agreeing with him, but I believe he will have the Republican Party in general agreeing with him, with very few exceptions. And I think the consequence of that could be that significant portions of the country, particularly states that are Republican-dominated, both governor and state house, might say that they don't regard the election as a legitimate election and don't therefore regard the federal government's authority as legitimate. And we already are hearing talk about secession, and I think that that is a real possibility in 2024. And we tend to forget how fragile our institutions are, how much they rest on public consent and really nothing else. And so if a significant portion of the country no longer considers the government legitimate, then we're at the point of breakdown. And in the United States, that doesn't mean revolution, it means returning to the states in terms of, the federal government breaking down, which is something that, again, has happened in this country and I think is, very possible can happen again.
I agree with that. I think we're not out of the woods yet with this, and it depends on what happens in 2024. There are so many things that are in play here with possible indictments, cases, and so forth. I don't think that secession formally is something that people would do. I think the difference between the first time is that you had a really regional split, and here even red states have large numbers of people who are blue. And so it's not easy to divide all of it, but certainly non-cooperation, recalcitrance, those kinds of things could be a part of it as well. So I'm worried about that as well. I don't think this is all done.
I guess I'm kind of like Jelani, I'm sort of except that he's a professional historian and I'm an amateur one. But I'm thinking a lot these days about the period after Reconstruction, and not just metaphorically. I mean, it's possible to kind of overstate the historical illusions, but the reality is this is a period of segregation and resegregation amidst increasing diversity. And for somebody like me who on the last 3 years has been really working on looking at narratives around immigrants and immigration, I mean, we're at the most anti-immigrant point that we've been literally since 1965, since the Hart-Celler Act. And, and you can see now, I mean, you're in Texas, right, Adam? SB 147, right? The return of alien land laws, right? And the period of post-Reconstruction, in addition to a period of increasing anti-Black and racial violence, was also a period that culminated with, for immigrants, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so you know, to me, it's still very much a period of danger. 2030 is a really interesting number because we were all kind of looking at 2042, and now we've moved the goalposts up 12 years, and I just think that we've got a lot to kind of go through at this particular point.
Yeah, so again, I'm Olatunde Johnson. I'm from the law school. And so maybe I see things a bit through that lens. It's hard to even calculate how many conferences and convenings we've had on the question of democratic crisis. And we were having them before 2016 around congressional gridlock, polarization, economic inequality, but it just really intensified after 2016. And I think a real turning point was January 6th, which really posed just a big challenge to how we thought about democracy and the resilience of our democracy, and really led a lot of us to really look structurally in a way that we hadn't before at the ways in which the Constitution itself was inadequate to the moment and was insufficiently resilient. I do think that you're right to point out the ways in which our institutions are resilient. We have been studying that. There, for example, we know there are a lot of challenges on the voter ID and the right to vote and electoral systems, but there are other ways in which the story can be a little bit more optimistic about how some of those local institutions, through independent, nonpartisan civil servants, really withstood those challenges. So I don't think we have to build on those positive examples, but I think the threats are really, they remain, and partly they're about the things we're talking about today and over the next 2 days about information and disinformation and the media environment. But I think that what we are beginning to think about a lot in law are the ways in which legal institutions, be it the Constitution itself, the role of the Supreme Court, the ways in which that operates to sort of compound or not address the problem. The last thing I'll say, so I'm sure you have a long list of interesting questions for us, is just, I do think that, at least on a personal level, and when I talked with some of my colleagues after 2 years of organizing a convening called Democracy's Futures, and we put it as futures. That was my colleague Jed Purdy, who's now back at Duke. But the conception is really that democracy has to change. I think when we started the whole project, it was how are we going to shore up our resilient our democracy to be more resilient in the form that it is, and now we're thinking more about how does it have to transform, and so I think that's true for press and media too.
I'm deeply concerned about what's happening at the state level in terms of stratagems, tactics particularly, to interfere with election, those who have oversight over election results. And this is it's a very serious matter. There are, in red states all over the country, a variety of voter suppression tactics that are underway and being built and not being sufficiently halted or fought against or diminished. And then there's also capture of the capacity, those positions that have the authority to determine the credibility, the validity of election results. This is terrifying, and it reminds me I'm a historian of the press. My work lately has been very focused on what happened in the U.S. South to bring Reconstruction to an end, and from post-Reconstruction all the way up to the 1965. And what you have in the South happening is white newspaper editors and publishers actively collaborating as political actors with business leaders and with political leaders, and some of them are actually political party actors. And what they are doing is the South is an authoritarian section, large swath of the country, for about 100 years, at least 90 years. And they are these actors. They're controlling the information sphere, they're controlling public discourse, and they also are building, quashing voting rights And there's election fraud all over the place in the South for a very long period of time. And so we've got precedent in this country to understand what is happening before us right now. It's just very difficult to pay attention to all of the authoritarian tactics that are underway that are attacking democracy at the moment. And this is a panel about the press, and the press has a huge role to play here. And I've got a lot more to say about that, but I've spoken too much already.
But isn't it normal for people to normal and healthy for people to disagree about politics in a democracy? What's particularly unusual about today's polarization or the nature of what's happening now?
That people want to. I mean, there's a difference between policy differences and wanting to overthrow the system, right?
And there's also. Oh, well, here we go. There's also a difference between, well, not accepting the results of elections, not accepting the legitimacy of the other party. It's not just that I disagree with you, I think you're satanic or the devil or you don't deserve to rule. And before, you play by the rules of the game, you lose, and then your response is to say, well, we'll get them next time. What did we go wrong? It's like, how did we miss in putting forth our message, and how did we lose? And now it's, you illegitimately won, you don't have a right, we're going to change the rules. If you're elected, whatever power that particular office has, we're going to strip them of that. And it's the refusal to see the legitimacy of the other side I think that's different. I mean, people probably always said that, but they didn't, and certainly in the South, they worked it out. But since Reconstruction, the idea, and since the Voting Rights Act, since the 60s, the idea that, in my knowledge of politics, is that if you lose, and then you come back, and then you win. You see the party changes hands, but now they're not willing to accept that.
I mean, I guess one thing I would note and add is that in some sense, this is all at a period in which we are more of a democracy than we've ever been, right? And so and I think those are the things that are converging, and what's so interesting about, thinking about Reconstruction, which everyone keeps invoking. You cannot say that America was a democracy in any point in terms of, at its inception, in the post-Civil War period, certainly not through the 20th century, in the most major move towards being a full democracy. I'm not saying it didn't have any of the components of it, but in terms of access to the ballot, being a key component of how we define democracy, I mean, that's 65 with the Voting Rights Act, and that's the moment. So in some sense, those two things are going at the same time, right? There's a kind of, I always refer to, Levitsky and Zaplick's book, How Democracy Dies. And it's so interesting because it does talk about sort of the key planks of democracy and the ways in which that's beginning to be eviscerated. But at the same time, what kept a kind of stasis was an agreement on a kind of white supremacy and a racial ordering, right? And when you begin to take that apart and have this more inclusive democracy on a number of different dimensions, including gender, that's when the center is beginning to fray. So these two things are competing, and that's why I think also looking at what that looks like going forward, the 2030 moniker is really important. It's not going back to some time we were in, because it wasn't a good or complete time. Yeah.
It's all relatively new.
Yeah, the difference is that the narrative on the other side is inherently anti-democratic, and that's like you said. There's the center holding around what we believe democracy to be. Now that it's no longer buttressed or holding up white supremacy, we're in the process of trying to create that new narrative, and being attacked by folks who are fundamentally anti-democratic. And I think that the sooner we kind of recognize that, the sooner we can kind of get to grips with where we need to go beyond 2030.
One other thing, only thing I would say, taking off on what you're mentioning, the other difference is that these people are in league with, are sympathetic to people overseas.
Right.
It's not just domestic. It's a part of a worldwide movement, and there are people, former enemies, people who we spent trillions of dollars opposing, now are their friends. So that's another difference.
I would say too, we all know this, you all know this, but in the last several decades, there has been a rise of a right-wing news media ecosystem that's vastly different from the reality-based. We all know this, right? We're living with two very different, very polarized news media system, and you've got on the right, most Americans center to the right of center pay attention to Fox News. That's where they're getting the great bulk of their information from. And Fox News, in my view, is very tied to the right-wing movement, to Trumpism as a movement. And when you've got a news ecosystem where a lot of Americans are still, on the left or in the center, people pay attention to a lot of different news sources. Their news media diets are very diverse and attuned to facts and to a kind of liberal, democratic, multiracial commitment. On the far right, there's something very different going on, and it's problematic, right? You've got a political movement with a very strong news media system tied to it, and then you also have these violent impulses and commitments, this kind of really fringe violent organizations that are paying attention to all of this. There's so much that I study in the past in the South that all of this seems very reminiscent of.
Some conservatives have argued that, there is a critique of the press that particularly during the Trump years, the press became so overtly anti-Trump that some of the reaction of what you're seeing is a response to liberal overreach, particularly in the press, particularly on social justice issues. There was a big backlash to the coverage of the social justice protests following the murder of George Floyd. Is that critique legitimate? Is there something, or is there something to it, or do you think it's wrong?
It's wrong.
But why do you think it's wrong?
I'm sorry. Can you say the question again?
Yeah. To what extent is conservative distrust in the press a reaction to what they saw as the press being overtly and deliberately and consciously anti-Trump, who was a Republican president, who in their view represented, half of the electorate?
Right. No, there's the left made us do it argument is very prevalent, and that is, especially for, the anti-Trump, Republican. But I think that, there's no question that the Trump supporter regards as the number one enemy the media, the whole liberal structure, and that goes back a long time. That's not a new phenomenon. That's not a product of the Floyd, aftermath. It's been true for a long time. In fact, the appeal of Trump to them, I've from my sins, I've been reading lots of focus groups of double Trump voters, 2016 and 2020. And the thing is, we sort of, I think, those of us who are not with them sort of tend to think that they enjoy owning the libs and all that. But actually, I find that their perspective is one of defensive. They feel under siege, and they think that Trump is the only person who has the courage to take the incoming from the liberal media and stand strong. And I've heard that you can see them saying over and over again, he's the only Republican who can withstand, it's not so much even fight back, it's withstand the attack. So it's just structurally the case that what this movement is against is liberalism. By the way, I don't think they're against it's complicated to say they're against democracy, because this anti-liberal tradition in America, which goes back a long way, often situates itself in a hyper-democratic mode, i.e. the distant government is unreliable and can't be trusted. Only our local government can be trusted. So it's complicated, but what they are is anti-liberal. And I don't mean liberal versus conservative. I mean liberal as in, individual rights in our system. And since the press is inherently a liberal institution, not liberal versus conservative, but liberal in that sense, then they're opposed to the press. And it's not the press's fault that they're opposed to the press, it's their problem. Now, of course, it's also our problem, but anyway, sorry.
I want to come back to this actually, because I've also, for my sins, been looking at a lot of polling, and we did a lot of research as well. And there's a way out of this particular quandary that you're mentioning, I think, or at least we think that there is. So I want to come back to that, but I don't want to sidetrack the question.
No. Please go ahead.
For the last 3 years, we've been looking a lot at narratives around immigrants and immigration. And one of the things that we found is everybody across the board, all folks, regardless of political orientation, gender, affiliation, Trump voters, Obama, Biden voters, whatever, everybody's exhausted. Everybody is feeling very, very scared and anxious. And they're scared about a whole bunch of things. They're scared about violence, they're scared about the pandemic, they're scared about climate change, they're scared about war, they're scared about all kinds of stuff. And they're feeling very isolated. But one of the things that we did was we kind of flipped it on its head, and we asked even Trump voters, what would you think of trying to give people the right to be able to move where they'd like to be, right? And that would be the best way for people to thrive. And we got a lot of folks coming over on that. Because the thing that folks are really interested in this particular moment is, to go back to Dr. Johnson's point, futures. Like seeing what a shared future can look like. Seeing a future that people see themselves in. So even Trump voters can see themselves in a pro-immigrant future if it's framed in terms of freedoms. This is a moment in which freedom, the idea of individual liberal freedoms and collective freedoms, these things are kind of coming together. When we look at the midterms, right, some of the surprise wins, John Fetterman's campaign was all about reframing freedom. And I think that's potentially something that brings people back to sort of an optimistic space to look at the future. Now, race is still going to be the number one thing in all of that. So we're very unsure about what that looks like when you actually really start testing it. But we have to move towards a future that we haven't envisioned yet. It's hard for us to look to the past for markers around this, and that's I think the biggest problem that we're facing is that people want it, but who can put it out there, and how can people make it feel like it's something worth it trying to achieve together?
It's very tough when you mention the issue of race, because that's at the heart of this. I would imagine things would begin to break down when you talk about what people moving where,
Right.
and that's an issue.
So this is, I think this is a question that is, I think, of interest to the historians on the panel. But all over the country, we've seen Republican-run states imposing new restrictions on public school curriculums and university curriculums, particularly around discussions of race. Is this a problem for democracy, or, as some on the right argue, merely democracy at work?
It's a problem for a multiracial democracy. If you want to have a true multiracial democracy, we can't have it the way you were describing, what we all know it was pre-civil rights movement, when there was a putative democracy and authoritarian Southerners controlled things and did not, in fact, allow other people to participate. So it depends on what terms. I mean, taking books out of libraries, preventing teachers from talking about certain things and in the name of democracy is a little much. I mean, because you're not taking all people's views and interest into account when you do that?
I recommend to everyone this nonpartisan organization called Protect Democracy. They have put together last summer this little pamphlet book. You can download it, called The Authoritarian Playbook. It's for journalists, by the way, and it teaches journalists what the authoritarian playbook is and how to cover it. And there's some really, I believe Sherry Berman here, a political scientist, was on the team. Zyblet and all these folks who study these things were helped create this authoritarian playbook. But one of them, spreading disinformation, that's one of the tactics. Targeting vulnerable, marginalized communities, quashing criticism and dissent, politicizing independent institutions, which we hope our public schools and higher education are. When we're talking about anti-DEI legislation, when we're talking about anti-CRT rules and regulations, these are all straight out of these kind of authoritarian playbook. And it is these are gag orders. These are thought control. These are attempts to decenter Black history from American history. It's profoundly problematic, because when you do that, what you have is a whitewashed history. And it's just, and we get to a kind of narrative that I grew up with in the South that I then had to unlearn, and that's not what we want in this country. But it's what a lot of white folks in this country learned. People of my generation, even younger than me, and certainly folks older than me, and it's a problem.
I'm going to start asking y'all individual questions, but other of you can weigh in if you feel like you have something to say. Olatunde, did I pronounce your name right? So this is a bit of field of the press question, but are the main legislative wins of the Civil Rights era, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, going to survive a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and what does the country look like without them?
I think this is a really big and important question. I just was finishing teaching about the Voting Rights Act this past week with my students, and really looking at the cases that are coming forward. As many people know, the Shelby County case was a big and important case on this in saying unconstitutional Section 5 effectively. It's really Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which
Can you explain what those are just in case?
So certain states and counties, jurisdictions that had a long history of voting violations were covered in 1965. They were subject to a special procedure where any kind of change they made, they had to pre-clear those changes with either a court or the Justice Department on the idea that it didn't have a racial effect or wasn't adopted for the purpose of discrimination or damping minority votes. And the Supreme Court in 13, declared it unconstitutional. The coverage formula, Congress had reauthorized it. And it's a really important moment when the court did that for a number of reasons. I think everyone should read that opinion. One, because it really flattens out the Reconstruction amendments. They almost sort of disappear from the Constitution in the way the majority talks about it. So the 15th Amendment, so you can think of the Reconstruction period with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment as launching a new America, right? It's, you get a new Constitution that still has aspects of our 1787 Constitution, but also has commitments to equality or non-discrimination and to congressional power that had never existed before. And the court really, in its opinion, really celebrates the notion of federalism that's kind of based in this original Constitution of 1787, but doesn't acknowledge the fact that post-Civil War, we tried to create a union. We gave all these powers to Congress. And even though this was bipartisan legislation, the Voting Rights Act reauthorization, the court really doesn't give that much heed to what Congress does. So that's also a really powerful move when you have the Supreme Court saying that something that was passed overwhelmingly. Okay, so then fast forward, so we know what happened after that. So there was a sense of like a lot of things on race, you know, there's been progress, and there has been progress on voting rights, right? But that progress meant we didn't still need the Voting Rights Act in the form that it was. And so after that is when it opens the door, literally the day after that, to some of the voting restrictions that you see being put in place. And so that part of that federal tool that was there is gone. Okay, and there's no getting it back because the Supreme Court has claimed it a constitutional limitation on your ability to protect voting. So the other main way of protecting voting is, from a litigation perspective, is that you file an affirmative lawsuit and that says that a certain practice has the intent or effect of discriminating. And that's what's before the Supreme Court this term, is whether or not that provision of the Voting Rights Act, which remains, which is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, whether it will stay in the form. And I think it's, you know, the court may just weaken it without completely dismantling it. I'm not going to fully predict. I don't know, but it would be a very dangerous thing if the court gets rid of that protection. Then the main legislative protection would be newly enacted. You'd have to reenact the Voting Rights Act in some way, but within congressional power, or enact more protections for voting. And those things have been before Congress, right? H.R. 1. You know, the John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act, and, you know, other kinds of measures that really shore up voting. I think it would be a real disaster and really open the door to more restrictions on voting if the court got Section 2 or even weakens it. Like we've been saying with a lot of things, it's a dangerous time for this, and it really leads to also questions about the Supreme Court, and which we haven't touched on, and there's probably not enough time to go into. But we were on a panel last week where people were talking about this as being a very imperial court. It's a court that, partly because of the 6-3 majority, as you said, the way it views precedent, it's trying to enact a kind of very different theory of congressional power that would really limit your ability to protect equality and advance anti-discrimination.
In my other job, I'm a law professor too, and one of the fascinating things about that case is how they take originalism. Originalism only applies to the Constitution of 1787 to 1789, the original one. We don't think about, as you said, the transformation of the Constitution by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they don't think about what was originally intended there because it would be too transformative.
Jeff, you've written that the affirmative action cases the Supreme Court represents, quote, the same old racial scapegoating, and that, quote, ending affirmative action in university admissions will mark a new era of resegregation of higher education with dire impacts on American democracy for generations to come. Can you explain what you mean by that?
In 140 characters or less? No, what the Ivy Leagues have is a problem of scarcity. And what education in America's problem is a lack of accessible quality education for all. So to confuse the problem of scarcity in the Ivy Leagues, in particular at one university, for the problem of education in the US as a whole is really missing the point. There are more Asian Americans enrolled at San Francisco City College than there are enrolled in the entire Ivy Leagues. And so, the problem here is we've seen schools resegregated. Dr. Johnson has written about this. I've written about this at the K-12 level, even as we're heading headlong towards 2042, when the U.S. will supposedly be a majority-minority country. And we haven't done anything about school resegregation. This will ensure resegregation at the higher education level. We're already talking about these seats at these so-called elite universities being apportioned largely to people of wealthy classes. And so, there's no substitute, there's no proxy for race other than race. And the diversity standard that we already have here is a very greatly weakened proxy for that. And to minimize that or what's the word?
Diminish?
Diminish that, thank you. To diminish that even more is going to put us even further from where we need to go. A lot of folks have cited, the fact that we are now at the University of California. I'm living in California, originally from Honolulu, Hawaii. But at the University of California, we've gotten near at UC Berkeley and UCLA to the numbers that it was before affirmative action was eliminated. The difference now, right, is that you're talking about a class that's about 20% Latino. You're talking about a state that's 50% Latino in terms of the graduation. So the gap there is a gap of, what is it? I can't do the math fast enough, Asian bad at math. It's about 25 years, right? That's a generation that we've lost of folks. And I think that would be horrible. The implications of that would be horrible.
Annette, I was going to ask you about Texas, but I'm going to ask you a different question, as much as I wanted to. Your work on the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings was met with a strong backlash at the time from scholars who did not want to acknowledge the volume of evidence that you had gathered regarding their relationship. What do you think was the reason for that response? And do you see any parallels between that and the effort to limit public schools' history curriculums across the country, both in higher education and lower education?
Well, there was an image of Jefferson, who's standing right outside here. There was an image of Jefferson as the personification in some ways of white America. I mean, he's up on Mount Rushmore. He stands for something. People think about the Declaration of Independence as America's creed. He created that. And I think that there was great amount of identification with him. People who are really interested in Jefferson, they're sort of pretend Jeffersons themselves in a way. And it's like I'd given them, a girlfriend they didn't want or something. There was a reaction to, a visceral reaction to it on the part of a lot of people, I would say historians. Now, strangely enough, people out in the public, the American public has never really, most people haven't had a problem with. Barbara Chase Riboud wrote a novel about Sally Hemings that was a bestseller, and people just kind of incorporated that. But I think white historians were very upset about the changing image, and I think there was some upset with the idea that I, a law professor writing history, but also a black woman, was challenging a group of white male historians who were seen as the keepers of Jefferson's flame. So it was a combination of discomfort with a new Jefferson, because you have to change the story. If you go to Monticello now, the story has changed, and you would have to do that. You can't add a woman and 4 kids to somebody's life without thinking about that person in a different way. And it is related to the story that people are trying to suppress now, because if the thinking is if Jefferson had this, had 7 children, 4 who lived to adulthood with the woman over 38 years, then in some ways he's not white. And this is not a white country, and this country, the beginning story, the origin story is complicated. And I don't think people want a complicated story, and they want the story that they were told, which didn't include this, and which didn't include African American people or indigenous people as part of the origin story of America. So it changes things profoundly.
Kathy, you, in the 19th century in particular, partisan newspapers were often vectors for racist conspiracies. When you think about those 19th century newspapers, you've talked about it a little bit. They're replete with stuff that is just kind of made up to get people riled up. Do you see the American press as still operating that way to any extent? And what role does social media play in being a vector for those kinds of stories now?
Yes, I do. So the press has soft power and hard power. Soft power to spread narratives about the way things are and to normalize certain kinds of ideas and ideologies and practices, et cetera. So in the post-Civil War South, white newspapers spread all kinds of ideologies about white supremacy, supposed black depravity, about the need to quash black political power, the need to quash economic aspiration and opportunity and educational for black Southerners. So these were stories that they told in the newspapers. But these newspaper publishers and editors also exercised hard power because they held very influential positions in their societies. And they were either, some of them owned other businesses, some of them had their hands in the till in the convict lease system, some of them helped instigate, at the very least normalized lynching, but some of them actually participated in instigating lynchings. You also had white newspaper publishers and editors who were, if not political actors, like formal political actors in helping run Democratic Party campaigns, they were very tightly knit collaborators. And so in the South, what you have Ethelbert Barksdale in Mississippi, who is running the Jackson Clarion in 1875, and he collaborates with the leader of the Democratic Party, and they come up with a devious campaign that year, and it uses electoral fraud and violence at the polls, and it also, they massacre hundreds of black Americans, black Republicans, and they, that's hard power. There's nothing harder power than when you are arranging a massacre in order to regain power in the state legislature. This happens in many places in the South. You have in 1898 in North Carolina, y'all probably know about the Wilmington Massacre and the stolen election in North Carolina 1898. You have the Raleigh News and Observer, Josephus Daniels, who there's a biracial political coalition in the South in North Carolina that has gained power in the state legislature and the governorship and in the city of Wilmington, which was the largest city at the time, majority black, thriving black middle class. What do the white Democrats do with the help of the Raleigh News and Observer as its arm? They have they steal elections and institute violence and spread ugly stories about black men assaulting white women, and they then execute a coup d'etat and massacre of between 60 and 300 black Wilmingtonians and burn the black newspaper there, right? So today, we have a deep history in this country of news institution leaders using their news institutions to lead reactionary, right-wing, white supremacist, violent, insurrectionary movements. I'm sorry, I said a lot of words there, and none of them were in the right order. Social media today, it amplifies and extends, and now we have people in all kinds of information bubbles. We did back then too, but we didn't have social media, and the easiness of spreading lies is bigger.
I'm going to ask Robert a final question, and then we can go to questions from the audience. Robert, you've been a supporter of American interventionism in the past, seeing it as necessary to protect liberal values. But societies that go to war often take on a war mindset, and they can become increasingly accepting of authoritarian means at home. We saw this in World War I with the Red Scare, the Palmer raids. After World War II, we had a second Red Scare, and you've made critiques of Lincoln as sometimes acting like a tyrant during the Civil War. It was in Persuasion. Is Trump a product of those kinds of forces as well?
No.
You don't think Trump coming to power as a critiquing the Iraq War, talking about national humiliation, extolling the virtues of torture, you don't think that has anything to do with the 20 years of war on terror that came before?
No. And also, I didn't say Lincoln was a tyrant. Lincoln.
That's not what I said. I said sometimes he
people
acted as a tyrant.
accused people of Lincoln of being a tyrant because Lincoln was operating in an extra-constitutional situation,
That's
which
right.
is unfortunately the situation that I think President Biden's going to have to operate in as well. I mean, the thing about, can we get back to talking about secession again? Sure. If you want to have a conversation about foreign policy, we can have a conversation about foreign policy, but it seems like it's a bit of a reach to try to like explain our entire domestic crisis, which, by the way, has historical roots going back to the founding in terms of the Iraq War. You
I
know?
wasn't really asking about
but
foreign
I'm really
policy.
more interested in talking about, can we just, the secession point that you made was interesting because, you know, it isn't regional in the same way that it was, but we had numerous secession movements in the United States other than, including in the 1780s and 1790s in Western Massachusetts. And the divide then was rural-urban. And to a large extent, or at least, you know, East Coast versus settler communities. And here again, I think we do have an urban-rural division. But when you get down to the individual states, and it's true, how you have a secession in a situation where not everybody agrees, but not everybody agreed in the South either.
No, they didn't.
And so it seems to me that we are faced with the possibility that in states, as I say, that are dominated by Republicans in the State House, you know, they can undertake actions, and the people in the state who don't like it can leave if they don't like it.
That's why I said it would be recalcitrant and so forth. It's not like, you know, Jeff Davis and Alexander Stephens say,
right,
we declare ourselves the Confederacy.
Right.
But they will not cooperate. They will disregard federal things.
They might name, if 5 or 6 states, and I mean there are 22 states that are dominated by Republicans in both houses, and so if even a handful of them agreed, then you would have a confederation.
Okay.
And just to bring in the foreign aspect of it, I think if they declared themselves a confederated state of the United States in that respect, Russia would immediately recognize them.
Possibly. No, it's possible. We would react.
Well, no, I've tried to think this through. I mean, we've been on enough time to go through this and everything, but I mean, let's say that it happens, okay? Let's say Idaho says we're not recognizing
Tennessee.
Pick your state, okay? Yes, the federal government in theory has the power to bring them back into line by denying them the funds or doing whatever. But would the federal government would the president be allowed to do that by Congress is another question. And would he do it? And the only thing I'm going to say about this, the only way these secession movements were ever stopped was by force.
With force.
It was never stopped in any other way.
Oh, no, it's a question.
And so
it's always force.
I just, you know, anyway, that's what keeps me up at night, is the fact that we could be in that situation and the federal government would not have an easy time responding.
Okay, why don't we go to questions in the audience?
Please line up at the mic.
Yeah, you got to line up at the mic.
Is it on?
I think it is on. While we're lining up, may I ask a question in the interest of time?
Please continue.
Yeah, what I've heard here is that there is a responsible fact-based press and that then there is this right-wing social media that skews facts, that uses misinformation. And I have a bit of a problem with this based on my personal experience. So what I've discovered in my litigation is that judges gave themselves in Pearson against Ray, that is a case well known today because it gives qualified immunity to the police. They gave themselves absolute immunity, including situations where judges acted, quote unquote, maliciously and corruptly. And so I thought, oh, what a wonderful headline for New York Times, Washington Post, to put on the front page, full third of American government gave itself the right to act from the bench maliciously and corruptly. So I go to the news organizations and no one wants to know, no one. And I actually found only one side, the New English Review, that was willing to publish online.
I'm sorry, is there a question?
Yes. So there is a question about press credibility, that I will agree that the press does not lie, that the mainstream press does not lie by commission, but it lies by omission, by not telling us what's important. I would argue that the fact that the full third of
That's
America.
not a question. Can you please ask a question?
Well,
I don't want to hear what
okay,
you're
a
arguing.
question.
Can you ask
The question then is, why is the press refusing to cover 1/3 of American government? Why does it cover the executive, Trump, etc.? Why does it cover the legislative, Santos, etc.? But when it comes to judges and how they actually adjudicate cases, not how they island hop on borrowed airplanes, but how they actually adjudicate cases by not adjudicating the party's argument, but just inserting their own argument, replacing party's argument with their own, totally bogus one, and deciding cases arbitrarily the way they want to. And when they're sued for fraud, they say we have the right to acknowledge.
There are other people who have to ask questions. I heard your question.
Okay. So
my
my
answer is you are discussing one of the most covered things in American life. The judiciary is this is the first time I've ever been any place and someone has accused me of not covering the judiciary.
Oh, really?
So thank you for your question. Can you let the next person go, please?
Okay. Oh, well, I was going to say that to the extent, thank you, that there's, I don't know if there was a setting up of that dichotomy, but I do hear that, this sort of notion that shouldn't we critique the mainstream press? So I say this as the person who is not the press person here. I think that is, I think there does have to be a lot of self-reflection in the, what we call the mainstream press. And I mean, if you think about why is there a rise of social media? I mean, you could all tell sort of anecdote, there's a lot of documentation of this, but like my own anecdotal story is that the day I joined Twitter was actually when tanks were rolling down in Ferguson, because I suddenly realized I needed more information sources. I needed firsthand information sources I couldn't believe. And it's not that the press didn't cover that, but it's just to say, I think we should always ask what we're not covering. And I think there's something very powerfully democratizing. We talk about the negatives of social media, but something very democratizing about having these access of information.
Yeah, my question is about the 2030 title of this panel. There's been discussion so far about if Trump loses and complains and people get agitated and there's going to be secession by the red states, et cetera. But I'm much more concerned about what happens if Trump wins the election, because I think that will be such a sharp right turn that it's really apocalyptic. And no one has actually talked about that option, at least that I remember so far today. It was 5 or 6 years ago that there was hand-wringing about Trump lies. Should we say he lies, or should we say he's stretching the truth? And now we all say lie. I'm a journalist, by the way. So, I mean, isn't it time, Dr. Gordon-Reed, you talked about the devil, and I mean, maybe he's not satanic, but he's pretty close to it. And if the press doesn't take on the Trump issue...
Sir, can you please ask the question?
That's exactly right. If the press doesn't take on the Trump issue from that apocalyptic standpoint, aren't we really in trouble getting to 2030?
Thank you.
Well, it's tough because the mainstream press, one of the criticisms of it is that it's both sides, and it doesn't matter what the side is, the devil or whatever. And I understand that, not wanting to put themselves in the position of making judgments about something and being partisan. But if you have a figure who is so far outside of what we consider the norm, they don't really seem to know how to handle dealing with somebody who basically says, I don't agree with that. And most of the things that we thought of as in terms of being laws, they were really norms and customs that everybody observed. And when somebody comes along and says, I don't want to do that, how do you handle them? And I still haven't seen evidence that there's a real grappling with the fact that if you play by the rules, pretending that it is normal, then it becomes normal. And then that is apocalyptic.
Amy Stone, class of '69. I want to thank all of you for giving us plenty to think about. And my question is, did the organizers of FaultLines Democracy consider including any panelists that weren't basically in agreement with each other? Anyone from the right?
You want to take this one, Robert?
It's hard to know what we agree on and what we don't agree on. I think we all agree, but I do think that this is. Other people can jump in on this, but I just want to say that I think this is the major challenge, right? Is the notion that when you talk about democracy, it's about talking about partisanship. I haven't said anything about my partisan affiliation. I haven't even talked about what my politics are, right? And so. I think it's just a continual challenge in this area. It doesn't mean that your point isn't well taken. There may be no one here who really absolutely, Adam positioned himself as a skeptic, but there's no one from the right-wing media. But this is a problem of the fundamental problem of sort of civil society at this moment. Like, what should we include views that are really hostile to basic tenets of democracy in every conversation. And so I ask it as a question. I mean, I take you mean it sincerely, but I think there are a range of views on this panel about that question and about a range of other questions.
Thank you.
I find their civility refreshing.
My name is Milton Alimadi, and I'm class of '92. I'm also an adjunct here in the J School. I'm born in Uganda. So growing up, I always wondered why Africans were depicted in a certain way in media. So when I had the opportunity to go to the J School here 30 years ago, I made that the subject of my thesis. And I studied the historical demonization, studied American media, and then I wrote my thesis paper. And my question is going to Professor Gordon-Reed, but to any one of you panelists, you can respond to it. And that is the backlash or the resistance by the powers that be in not wanting certain stories to be told. And in your case, of course, the story of Jefferson. So in my case, my research took me to the archives of the New York Times, and I unearthed, frankly, very ugly correspondence between reporters sent to Africa and editors here in New York. I'll give you just a quick bite. Homer Bigart, who's very renowned, won the Pulitzer Prize twice before he joined the Times.
Sir, I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap it up.
It's a question, but it needs context. I'm sorry, it needs context.
No, I think your question is important.
So he sent a letter to his editor here in New York saying, I cannot get enthusiastic about this assignment, the leaders, witch doctors, et cetera, et cetera. And then I went and read the articles published in the Times around that time, and there was a perfect correlation. And the editor sitting here in New York wrote back to him similar language saying, you're now the expert in American sorcery, in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So I published a thesis.
Sir, can you
The
please ask
Columbia
the question?
Journalism Review invited me to submit it. They took it, and then they declined to publish. I worked for 30 years and finally got it published as a book. Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. That was the other challenge. Now getting it reviewed has been the next challenge.
Sir, can you ask a question
So
of
my
the
question
panel,
to you
please?
is, how have you
Sir,
experienced?
we're over our
Can you
time.
ask
We're over
the
our
question?
time.
Question
So
now.
can you, in the next 10 seconds, pose a question?
Yes, I
because
will.
we have to go into the next thing.
Can you talk about similar backlash that you encountered after you published that book on Jefferson? Thank you.
Okay, very quickly. I had a much easier time than you had. It was the timing. People were ready to hear what I said. There were people who opposed it, but there were many, many more people who were supportive of it because they wanted to hear the story. But there are plenty of stories of backlash against people putting out stories and books and so forth that other people feel are detrimental or insulting to people whom they admire. But I was lucky. I was luckier than you.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to end the panel here. I know there are some people who wanted to ask questions. I'm sure our panelists would, some of them might be willing and kind enough to answer your questions if you come up to them afterwards. But we have to keep on moving to the next event. Thank you so much for coming and for listening. And thank you to our panelists for coming.
So I want to give a quick addendum to the panel, which are, well, there was a question that was posed to the organizers, and so I want to make sure that we respond and say that we, first off, I think that there was disagreement on this panel. I was thinking that in another 30 seconds, a UFC match was going to break out between Robert and Adam. But we reached out to a wide array of people, and we very conscientiously thought that we did not want everyone to be of the same political bent. What we got was a really wide array of folk who were available, and also a really interesting array of folk who were not. And so, to answer your question specifically, yeah, we do understand that there are a lot of different partisan affiliations, a lot of different political perspectives, a lot of different outlooks, but what we should have as a common ground is our belief in democracy. And so that was the operating thing. There are just two more quick points that I want to make. One is that we want to address these issues about democracy democratically, meaning that in order to make sure that everyone gets to the maximum number of people get to answer, to ask a question, we would like for you to stay within a 30-second time frame in posing your question. And that will allow us to kind of move through as expeditiously as possible to get to all of the, again, all of the perspectives. And the last thing I have to say is a note of sad news, which is some of you may have seen on your phones, that Harry Belafonte passed away this morning. And, tremendous loss. We're in this conversation about democracy, and he was a stalwart of democracy. People know him for his work as an actor and a musician, but he once said to me that people think of him as an actor who became an activist, and he said, it's the opposite. I'm an activist who became an actor. And so his ideas around the things that people don't know was that he personally, in the midst of the tumult of the 1960s, personally flew into Mississippi in the middle of the night to bring in funds that SNCC desperately needed to continue its organizing work. And because of the nature of the white supremacist bureaucracy there, they said, if you send this money by any means of like Western Union or any other, we won't get it. And so he personally, at this time, it'd be like, I don't know, even the top, like The Rock, saying I'm going to fly into the middle of this conflict to make sure that this money gets to these people to keep organizing. And he did that. And I'll take the liberty to tell you one thing. I had the honor of meeting and interacting with him on a number of occasions. And he once signed a book for me, autographed his memoir. And it said, Jelani, you get better looking every time I see you. And the next time I saw him, I said, Mr. Belafonte, no one would dream of calling him anything but Mr. Belafonte. I said, Mr. Belafonte, at first I thought that was a compliment. And then I realized you didn't say where my starting place was. And he laughed about that. But the last interaction I had with him was about 2 years ago when I was on television. I'd been talking about some other concern invariably under the rubric of democracy. And he called me to say, I saw you on television. I thought that you said exactly what needed to be said. Keep fighting. And those will be our marching orders. We will continue being about the business of democracy making, and that is why we're having this gathering now. So thank you. Our next panel is Democracy and the World. And I'm very happy to welcome for that discussion my colleague from The New Yorker, Masha Gessen. Jodie Ginsberg, the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And my colleague from Columbia Journalism School, Sheila Coronel.
Thank you, Jelani. I feel this conference should have come with a trigger warning because of all the very upsetting films and conversation. So we're here to talk about democracy in the world. I'm here with two very distinguished colleagues. So let's start off, the first panel was made up of historians and we're just journalists. But we can talk about how history has been weaponized. That's what we want. We talk about the weaponization of history, the weaponization of the law, the weaponization of the media ecosystem. Everything has been weaponized now. But we want to talk about history and how it has been weaponized. And I'd like Masha to start off with that because she's the unique perspective of having lived both in Russia and the US. Yeah.
Thank you. Now it's on. Okay. So, in the Soviet era, there was a dissident joke that the Soviet Union is a country with an unpredictable past. And what that conveyed very clearly was that historical narratives, like other totalitarian narratives, were entirely in the hands of the authorities. And you had to always be paying close attention to the correct line on history, right? It was one of the ways of controlling the population, of course, is to always be changing the messaging so that you never know what's true unless you were attentively listening to the television or these days to the pro-government telegram channels. It doesn't matter to what exactly, but you don't know what's true until they've told you what's true, right? And that's true of the present, and that's also true of the past. There are all sorts of figurative ways in which history has been weaponized, but of course in Russia right now, history has been literally weaponized. Right? The war, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was preceded by the publication in the summer of 2021 of Putin's long historical essay on sort of laying down the new totalitarian line on Russia and Ukraine, that basically said that that Ukraine doesn't exist, Ukrainian language doesn't exist, Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent country, and as totalitarian regimes see, according to Hannah Arendt, see themselves as as enforcing the laws of history. Once history was laid down, the law had to be enforced, and the war started. So that's a very literal way of weaponizing, but the figurative way, and I'll hand it over to you two. I think we can all talk about the figurative ways, which is of course a way of distinguishing us from them, is by looking at the ways people narrate history.
Well, this resonates very much with me because I come from the Philippines, and last year, Filipinos elected by a landslide Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who has come to power. I mean, there are many reasons for why he's why another Marcos is president, but one of the reasons is through the erasure of history, the erasure of a past of abuse, massive human rights abuses, and of world-class plunder. And it's happening not just in the Philippines, but in many other places. And it's not just erasure, but also the recasting of history. For example, Marcos Jr. said, the era of his father was a golden age. And the golden age narrative resonates a lot with in many countries. For example, in India, Narendra Modi is propagating the notion of a golden age of Hindu glory. And in Russia, the same thing, a golden age of Russian imperial glory. So this recasting and this erasure of history have actually been used to legitimize and to justify what I believe to be undeserved power and privilege. It is used to justify why another family who has plundered in the past deserves another round of power. In India, it's been used to clamp down on Muslims and other minorities. In Hong Kong, China is issuing new textbooks that say Hong Kong was never a British colony because China never signed the treaties that ceded Hong Kong to the British. And so they're saying, therefore, that China deserves to be in charge of Hong Kong. So history is being used to justify the coercion and the illegitimate assertion of power and domination.
And that has huge implications, right, for journalists, because our job is to try to speak truth to power, to report the truth. And if the narrative becomes something completely different, that puts journalists in the firing line. And I think what's really important when we start to think about the ways in which this works is you get a narrative seeded, often by those who are seeking power or who are in power. They're writing their essays, they're saying these things in rallies, but increasingly they're also putting these things into law. So journalists and academics who challenge that newly invented version of history are actually breaking the law. If you think a few years ago in Poland, for example, Poland introduced a law in which talking about Polish complicity in the Holocaust was a criminal offense. So any academic and journalist that talked about complicity, which there was in many cases, was breaking the law. And so you move from not just a narrative that is intended to build a movement of support, as we've seen in the Philippines and we've seen in Russia and Hong Kong, but also at the same time demonizes and criminalizes those who would report differently. And one of the reasons I think we've been asked to do this panel is to think about how that then reflects back into the US. Well, if you think about the recent Roe versus Wade reversal, I think I've been here about 3 weeks. I just moved to the US, and the sorts of narratives being used to talk about what was originally intended in the Constitution in the 18th century seems to me very much a reimagining of history intended to take us back to a golden age in which women frankly didn't exist or certainly shouldn't have any rights, and that talking about that and challenging that becomes potentially a criminal act. Talking about women's rights to abortion or to make choices becomes potentially a criminal act because you're passing on information that you shouldn't. So there, I think, are clear lines of concern that we can see, that we can draw from some of these attempts to weaponize and criminalize the reporting of history elsewhere.
This is not a new thing, Masha. In Russia, as you said, the past has always been an arena of what is new about what is happening now, both in Russia and the US and elsewhere.
Well, I don't know that it's significantly new, but I think that something that stands out to me is that I believe that all the sort of autocrats that we have seen rise around the world in the last, say, decade and a half all traffic in past-oriented politics, right? That wasn't true in the 20th century. 20th century totalitarianisms were mostly future-oriented. Right? They were going to take you into some imagined golden future. All these autocrats traffic in the ideas of the golden past, and that comes with traditional values, and that's part of what creates, all of these commonalities that we see in, the demonization of gender ideology, all the anti-trans legislation, the anti-women legislation, the reversal of all sorts of social rights that have been gained in the last decades.
I like very much this idea of the way, what you said about this idea of the past being used to justify, also to mobilize the public towards, illiberal thoughts and illiberal ideas, and to use the past to justify, as you said, both racial, gender, and other forms of repression. But what does it mean? What role do journalists play in all of this, right? We are overwhelmed. We're in a world where journalists are only a minor player. There are many more publicists than there are journalists. There are many more people doing acts of journalism, citizens doing acts of journalism, than there are journalists. What is the journalist's role in the middle of all of this recasting? Or Do you want to start? Well, I sometimes feel like I've been there before. I grew up in the Marcos dictatorship, and the journalist's role was this very different media environment. It was a media environment where information was very much constricted. 3 newspapers, 3 TV stations, very different from now. But the journalist's role was to test the limits and to go beyond the limits and to try and inform the public in various creative ways to get around those restrictions and braving those restrictions. I don't know exactly how we do it now when the problem is not the rationing of information, but the flooding of information in a public sphere that seems to be not controlled by anyone, but by Silicon Valley companies and by all of these people, mobilizing for anti-democratic members of the public. So it's coming from all sides. Yeah.
So I would say the job of a journalist is to see, investigate, verify, and explain, right? It's to convey what we are experiencing, but also to put that into some context for people. So this, for example, ability to say this, so-and-so said this, but actually that's not what happened, or this isn't happened. And these are the reasons why we know that, by the way, and this is the evidence that we have. And that's our job. It is extraordinarily complicated in a world, and Maria Ressa in the Philippines talks about that all this time, where we cannot agree on basic facts. The job of a journalist now has become extraordinarily complicated, and again, I think this is where we run into difficulties, particularly reporting out of places like the US and the UK, where we kind of assume that everybody's working against the same set of rules, right? But so there's some kind of set of rules that we all agree on. But if you've suddenly got leaders who say, I say this is a flower, and you say, you're the leader, and you say, oh, no, that's a caterpillar. Where do you go from there if you cannot agree on basic facts? And I think that's what we're struggling with as journalists, and what I think we were slow to reckon with, but we saw much earlier in places like the Philippines, that people were telling lies and we were reporting the lies as factual because somebody said that. And that was where I think that's where it became difficult, and where I think we continue to get ourselves into knot somewhat in trying to cover politics in particular, because we are dealing with people who are quite happy to peddle in lies, and our reporting of them as the statements as factual gets us in a little bit of a knot.
Well, I think that's partly an acknowledgement of the plain fact that journalists are really ill-equipped to deal with this particular kind of politics, right? Journalists are not historians. Journalists tend to defer to authority, even though we like to think that we don't, but we do, right? For example, when the Supreme Court turns its clerks into a bunch of amateur historians, journalists are really loath to engage with that on substance. And that's another journalistic bias that we have, particularly in this country, which is sort of the anti-substance bias, right? When we talk about horse race coverage and criticize it rightly, right? We often fail to talk about what it costs us, right? Despite all of the the glut of information that Jodie has described, there's a scarcity, there's a scarce value of journalistic attention. When journalists are looking at what this means for the future of the Republican Party, they're not looking at the substance of whatever the person that they're talking about has said, right? And I think we need to be more rigorous and more courageous in engaging with the substance of various statements that we report on. That's the first thing. The other thing that I think our job as journalists is to start taking the trope that journalism is the first draft of history very, very seriously. right? And to think of ourselves, in fact, as laying down the record for a future generation. And I say this as having worked as a journalist in Russia and actually just at the very tail end of the Soviet Union, and seeing what it's like for a society to confront a blank past, right? To confront the actual, well, or to fail to confront the absence of historical record. Some colleagues and I have actually, right after the war in Ukraine began, we've started a thing called the Russian Independent Media Archive, which is an intentional effort to preserve the archive of independent media. And what we've articulated is that, you know, we don't want to, when this is over, when the Putin era is over, we don't want to be in the position that we were in 30 years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed, when you had to try to make and fail, right, a superhuman effort to create a historical record.
That is very true. You know, one of the things I've written about the Marcos era was how this generation of Marcoses were able to achieve archival and narrative power. Because the Marcoses had a vast archive that is online, that is on the internet, that was very easy for their followers and their hired propagandists to use to, jazz up, to provide evidence of the so-called glory of the Marcos era. And I think counter-archive needed to be put out there because really, for ordinary people, ordinary news consumers, the internet is the archive, right? And so we have to put out there information that counters the dominant narrative and that empowers other people to provide alternative narratives of power. Let me just say, that the erasure of history from my own country's experience is that very few Americans know that at the turn of the century, the US invaded the Philippines and killed about 1 million Filipinos who died of hunger, disease, and fighting in a bloody war, in an attempt to suppress Filipino independence. And a lot of this has been erased from history. But there are, as you said, fragments of it, because there were some newspapers actually here in the US that wrote about that, and now we're relying on these accounts from the late 19th century to reconstruct and put together a history that has been erased. And in fact, you Americans talk about history being erased in your country, but American involvement overseas, that whole history has also largely been erased with this propaganda of the US being the leader and defender and promoter of the free world.
Yeah, and I think the key thing here is this absence of record is not just important post-fact, right? It's not just important for a record and a reckoning subsequently, it's important in the moment. And I think one of the things that's striking again about when you look at the comparisons made between the US, which is rightly very proud of its First Amendment and its media pluralism, compared to places where traditionally there's been only really government propaganda or very few sources, is the dearth of sources that you see in the States, particularly at local and community level, where media has essentially been eliminated and carved out, so-called news deserts. And what the space that's allowed is the kind of domination of media that we've seen in many other places, where one very powerful individual who is supportive of one side or other has been able to move into a community, essentially take over a local newspaper and pump out endless amounts of local political propaganda. So the kind of tropes that you see happening perhaps on a national level in autocracies elsewhere, we see playing out at a local level here in the States with the elimination of a pluralistic, hyper-local local media.
Masha, how are Russians able to do this when the entire Russian media is, under the thumb? I mean, how do you record, how do you report when there's, as we saw in the case of Evan, there's absolutely no freedom to report independently?
So I have a two-part answer to that. One is to acknowledge just how restrictive the current information regime is, right? And certainly the arrest of Evan Gershkovich drew attention to it, And I had a piece in the New Yorker trying to put it into context. There are two things that I think we miss about this arrest, right? One is that it is perfectly legal. And I think this is actually what I would point to as another common thread in contemporary autocracies that distinguishes them from 20th century autocracies. So if you looked at the laws that were in the books, on the books in the Soviet Union during the worst years of Stalinist terror, they looked okay. You know, they were like just regular laws that you would find in other countries. Not all of them, but a lot of them, right? What was not like countries that we think of as democracies was enforcement, right? There was no legal procedure. There were no defense attorneys. There were closed trials if trials happened at all. There were these sheets of paper with thousands of names on them of people to be executed that were just signed summarily, etc. But it wasn't legal, right? Which actually made it easier to start reversing in the brief period after Stalinist terror ended. In contemporary autocracies are legalistic. They everything that happens in Russia happens in accordance with the letter of the law. Everything that happens in occupied Palestine happens in accordance with the letter of the law, as Israel decides to twist it, but it's legalistic, right? And so Evan Gershkovich is jailed and is facing up to 20 years in prison for practicing journalism because Russian law says that collecting information for any purpose whatsoever, if it can be useful to a hostile power, is the crime of espionage, right? Or the crime of high treason if it's a Russian citizen. So Vladimir Karamurza, another journalist, was just sentenced to 25 years in prison last week for practicing journalism and political activism. So we've never, not even during the Stalin era, seen this kind of restrictive information regime in Russia. We've never seen it be this difficult for foreign correspondents to practice their craft. So that's one part of the answer, and the other part of the answer is almost the opposite, which is that Russian journalists, most independent Russian journalists, have left the country. Not all of them. The ones who remain in the country work anonymously. Some media outlets have been incredibly inventive in the way they work with these journalists. For example, they distribute assignments so that people are reporting only small parts of the story. It's very old school. The story is put together by an editor who is abroad, but it's a way of protecting, making it less easy to trace the source, and also to protect the journalist while they're working. Right? And of course, they've been incredibly inventive in what they can do from outside the country. And this is something that I think we need to be talking about more because, again, another new thing that we're seeing around the world is journalism in exile. Right? You didn't used to have journalists in exile. You could have a journalist who went into exile, but they pretty much stopped being a journalist when they did that, right? But this phenomenon of people working to cover their country, or in the case of Russia and the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine, for primarily the audience back home from exile is new, right? And they've done extraordinary stuff. They've by communicating with people through social media, by creating tip lines, they've managed to cover a war that Ukraine is not giving them access to.
And open source intelligence, which is a new
And open source,
way
absolutely.
Documenting war crimes, even without being there on the ground. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. But open source intelligence is something that Russian journalists have done a great job of, but conceivably someone else could do it too. What Russian journalists have done that only they can do is get people, often in the active military, to confess to war crimes on camera, right? Because they're speaking to another Russian, and because they're so fed up, and they have instant access to somebody who will listen. Right?
So, Jodie, we're seeing this all around the world, right? Both the weaponization of the law, as Masha said, especially new laws that are intended to restrict conversations online, and also the rise of exiled media. It's no longer, they're a huge community, and not just in Russia, but elsewhere in the world. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so let's put this in context, and I do want to come back and talk about the exile media, because I think that's a really key area. Last year, 67 journalists and media workers were killed as we documented them at the Committee to Protect Journalists. And that was a 50% increase on the previous year, and 363 journalists were in prison at the end of the year. That's the highest number in the 30 years that CPJ has been documenting this. So there is a direct link between this democratic collapse, this crisis of democracy that Jelani talked about, and the risk that that presents to journalists. And that's no surprise, right? Journalists are there writing the first draft of history. They are there trying to expose what governments who would rather keep these things hidden are doing, what big business is doing and corruption is doing. So as a profession, we are under threat like never before, and you see that too in the States, and I can talk a little bit about how that's playing out as well. But it's absolutely true that in the face of that, we are seeing two, I think, important phenomena that we haven't yet worked out really effective ways to deal with. One is the vast numbers of journalists now going into exile, where to some extent they can report. It's not ideal. Journalists want to be close as possible to their sources, but they can in ways that they've never been able to before, and need to do so securely. And I think, identifying ways that we can effectively support journalists in exile to do their job. We're seeing Latin America is a place where we're seeing huge numbers of journalists go into exile from places like Nicaragua, Venezuela, now Guatemala. They need safe places in the region where they can support one another to operate. And last year, the vast majority of direct assistance that we at CPJ gave was related to exile, and obviously that's also in part linked to Afghanistan and Myanmar and so on. So that's I think a really key area that we need to think about, is how do we support those journalists in exile. And then the second one is this related to this lawfare. Autocrats are not stupid, unfortunately. They've worked out that international governments would say respect the rule of law, so they invented laws to respect. And then, so now if you say you've unfairly arrested this journalist, they'll say, well, this is legal. We're respecting the rule of law. You asked us to respect the rule of law. That's what we're doing. And increasingly using non-speech-related laws to do it. And this is the real change. So it used to be that journalists were arrested for defamation, for crimes related to the content that they were producing. Increasingly, we're seeing governments arrest people under national security legislation, under terrorism legislation, and most worryingly and more recently under allegations of financial crime. Yeah. Right? We've seen it in the Philippines, we see it in Hong Kong with the case of Jimmy Lai, we see it in Guatemala in the case of Jose Ruben Zamora. And those are really difficult to challenge, because it's easy for me as a free speech advocate and a press freedom advocate to say, release that person, what they said was perfectly valid. It's much more complicated if someone's accused them of tax evasion and money laundering, because as journalists, our natural instinct is to say, oh, well, we need to investigate this, by which point that journalist might have been in jail then for several months, they've been smeared, they've been denigrated, all of which is intentional, of course, to create this idea that the journalist is untrustworthy, and therefore everything that they report is untrustworthy. So those are some of the tactics that we see being used, and almost certainly starting to come here.
Well, in the previous panel, I think you talked about the autocratic playbook that's used to suppress the media. And now we have, I think, an expanded playbook using the techniques of the past and new techniques, including the weaponization of old and new laws, as well as old techniques of curtailing advertising or directing advertising towards other pro-regime outlets, the weaponization of history. But I'm wondering, how much of this really, if you're talking about fighting back and all of that, is under the control of journalists, because I also see, you know, a lack of agency on our part, because all of you know, social media platforms are not controlled by us. They're controlled out here in America, in Silicon Valley. We have no say in the algorithms that govern what our citizens see, and which is very different when you were just talking about working in a local community or in a country where you can hold your own leaders to account. But here, with this globalized media ecosystem, how much power and agency do we really have?
Why don't you just start, Sheila? You keep asking questions. No, I mean, look, we don't, not only do journalists not control social media, journalists don't control traditional media. I'm sorry.
We don't control anything. We don't control
You know,
anything.
I mean, we have a way of talking about democracy and journalism as though we knew what democracy was, or as though we like had it just yesterday, right? And we had like near perfect journalism also just yesterday, and we just have to like fix a couple of things so that we get back to that perfect state. In fact, we had, in some respects, a number of good decades in American journalism when there was an accidental sort of synergy between the profit-making model of media and news exigencies, right? It just so happened that people needed to place enough classified ads, and companies needed to advertise enough to local markets for this news model to work. There's no reason in the world it should work. It is a crazy model.
Yeah.
Right? And
it wasn't the model, right? It was for a very brief period. It wasn't the model for journalism to be funded.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
But that's, you know, we act as though that is normal, and there's some reason it should work, and we should like just find some magical solution to get more clicks so that we can get back to that normal. But there's nothing normal about it, and unless we learn to talk about media as a public utility and journalism as a public utility, we're not going to really have a meaningful conversation about democracy and journalism.
That's so true.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is a separate conversation because I think we often are now in a space where we really desperately want to define public good and public interest in a very tight way that we can all agree on. And I'm concerned that as we think about funding models for journalism, there will be a desire to move to a state in which we can have the single truth of what is public interest journalism, whereas actually what is valuable to one community is not necessarily valuable to another. So I think we have to be very careful as we start to think about these other models for funding journalism about this question of public interest. But I couldn't agree more. I think being able to show our value is the agency that we have. You know, why does it matter? What is happening as a result? We increasingly at CPJ are talking not so much just about the journalist who was killed. Of course, that's important. The death of any journalist is a terrible tragedy, but also what the story that was lost in the process. What does the community lose? We're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the killing of the Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. It's not just the death of her as an individual, but what the community loses, what we as the community lose from that person and that report not getting out. And I think we probably have not done a good enough job talking about that. And I think the other thing that we have agency around, or certainly I would hope that news editors and newsrooms have agency around, is protecting the safety of their journalists. You know, we may not be able to control everything that Elon Musk does. I don't think Elon Musk is able to control everything Elon Musk does, but what we can do is make sure that people are supported to know what will happen if you receive abuse on social media and how to protect you from that, and what happened, you know, to make sure that people are not going into political rallies unprepared for the potential violence. And I think, you know, when we perhaps come in questions to talk about 2024 but there are lessons, I think, to be learnt from how journalists have been attacked offline after being attacked online and in political protests and at political rallies that I think we could learn from elsewhere as we move into what I think is going to be a very febrile 2024 in the States.
Well, one of the things that President Bollinger said in his opening remarks was that, you know, part of this whole discourse on democracy is really not just limited to journalists. And really, this is not just our role alone. I mean, it's very hard to say that you expect journalists to defend democracy for you, right? Because this is really something. Democracy is every citizen's. The guarding of democracy is something that every citizens and institutions in society should take care of. It's just that journalists are out there in the front lines and become sort of the canary in the coal mine when democracy is being threatened. But I really think that, you know, no matter how much agency or power or how little we have, and given the state of journalism, given the state of the information ecosystem, this is something that repairing the information ecosystem should not be left to us poor journalists. And it seems that there's a lot of expectations. It's almost like a messianic thing that we can do it, but the reality is we can't. And we need institutions of society to support us.
I agree, and you know, one thing I do want to reflect on, because it was striking to me as a non-American how this did not come up in the previous conversation. You know, I'm asked often, and we talked about it a little bit pre-panel, you know, is what makes America different, and you know, and I think, you know, there was a kind of, well, what the thing that makes America different is that America thinks that it's different, and you know, but actually there is one thing that makes America different, and you know, the fact that America has 46% of the world's civilian guns, 120 guns for every, does make it fundamentally different. It changes the rules of the game hugely for journalists, and I think that's the elephant in the room for me as someone working on journalist protection and journalist safety that doesn't really get talked about in America. But there is a fundamental difference. If I go to a protest and cover a protest, or I go to somebody's house in the UK to report on, you know, to ask them a question, but they weren't expecting me at the door, I will not be shot in the head. But it may happen here, and in fact, it's quite likely. And I think that is a paradigm, you know, completely different paradigm in which journalists and everybody else is operating that simply is not found elsewhere. Certainly not, you know, that's a level of danger for an ordinary journalist that you wouldn't experience. But the people who are shot and killed in Mexico largely are reporting on organized crime. They're not doing ordinary reporting, and I think that's a reckoning that America hasn't made.
I want to sound, and maybe this is my very skewed perspective, I want to sound a word of caution about protecting journalists. Because in this country, and this has a lot to do with the profit-making model of everything, in this country, care is often confused with liability. And I can see as we go into a dangerous political season, corporate media placing restrictions on journalists. This is something that journalists who report on wars, as I do, have experienced in the last few years particularly. Restrictions placed by them on them by corporations in the name of protecting them, but really for fear of liability. Right? So, I mean, we have to scrutinize the way that media outlets protect their journalists to make sure that it's meaningful protection, meaningful care.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think that fear of being sued is not a reason not to send people to cover important stories. I just, you know, I am conscious that when we talk about similarity and difference, there is a fundamental difference in the kind of environment, the environment in which journalists may be operating. That is a difference from, say, operating in Paris or Warsaw.
Well, the problem also is that many newsrooms are so under-resourced that they cannot afford to have the same kind of training, equipment, and other forms of protection for journalists to cover out their ordinary events like rallies and protests where they can be put in danger. I remember one student of mine had to beg covering the protest in Portland a couple of years ago, had to beg her editors to buy her gas masks. And they did. They ordered from Amazon. So that's the level of protection that local newsrooms have. And you kind of can't blame them either because of their strapped. We have time for some questions. So please, I see some of you already waiting there. They're ready to fire. Yes, please. And please line up. In front of the microphone. Yeah.
Sheila, thank you. I'm Drew Clark. Good to
Hi,
see
Drew.
you again. I'm a graduate of the J School, and I'm still in journalism. I run Broadband Breakfast, focused on technology and politics. And I really appreciate the way, Sheila, you kept bringing back the question of social media and Silicon Valley. And I'd love to ask a question about old media and new media, which I will pair together. What does the firing of Tucker Carlson mean for what the last panel talked about, and Russia in particular? And secondly, what can journalists do to guard against the chatbot attacks of the future that are present and here and are going to get worse? Is there a tech angle that any of you have that can protect journalists? Thank you.
Tucker Carlson, is this the end of... I think Americans have this notion that if you shut down, some Americans anyway, shut down Fox News, American democracy will be okay. I don't think that's the case. Fox News has a vibrant business model because it caters to a market that has been riled up, mobilized, and is willing to listen to this. It's profitable in its own. There is a section of American society that needs a Fox News, so I don't see how you solve that problem even if you remove Tucker Carlson and whoever, right? They are catering to a profitable market, and they will be there as long as the private-oriented media system that's largely unregulated in the U.S. remains. I don't know if you had anything
No,
else?
I mean, I don't want to diminish the importance of somebody extremely talented, somebody who has an amazing on-air presence, somebody who's erudite and articulate, which Tucker Carlson is. Perhaps the next Tucker Carlson will not be worse, or will be worse at that particular kind of work. But I think Tucker Carlson and Fox News exist because there's a market for it, and because the American media is structured like as a marketplace, right? Which it shouldn't be.
Do you have any thoughts about ChatGPT and the coming AI Armageddon, according to some people?
I mean, my simplistic answer to this is that we have to keep using the tools of journalism, right? I mean, I keep thinking about the Pope and his Balenciaga, whatever the AI thing was. The easy way to work out whether the Pope is running around in a big white puffy jacket is to call up the Vatican and ask, right? So, I just think some of these things I'm not dismissing that there are serious and legitimate concerns, not least, I think in newsrooms where people may use AI and then just decide that they don't need flesh and blood journalists. But I think some of the challenges and the fears that people have about AI are actually answered by the tools of journalism itself.
Yes,
Thank you. My name is Diana. I graduated from Columbia in 2011. I've attempted to forge a career in journalism ever since. It's been a pretty interesting 10 or so years. And we're standing in this very powerful place, as President Bollinger said this morning. This is kind of the most powerful, or the biggest journalism school in the world, and frankly the seat of, I suppose you could say, establishment media in America, which is by establishment, I am using the mic, by extension, the rest of the world. And at what point do we admit to ourselves, listing the myriad problems that we as journalists face? I'm a documentary filmmaker. I cannot sell a documentary film to the American or the international market right now because journalism has been so commodified. So we have this list of problems. At what point do we look at each other in this room, in this powerful place, and for journalism, and say, do we call a moratorium? How do we help ourselves fix our problems? Do we become more litigious? Do we become more activist? I don't think any journalist wants to think about themselves in that capacity, having to fight for our right to be, or the ability and the capacity to be journalists and to do our jobs and to investigate and to hold power to account. But how do we make that, how do we start to facilitate that for ourselves when we are faced with these challenges, these unprecedented challenges? And I'd be curious to hear what you think, what our role in that regard is to fight for our own careers, frankly. Thank you.
That's a tough one. I think there has, I mean, the media is challenged on so many fronts: financial, political, technological, and we each have to just be there in the trenches, fighting back in any way we know, because there's no single answer to that question. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name's Andrea. I'm a current student here, and I am originally from Guatemala. And so I was wondering, how would you approach being a reporter in a situation where press is being targeted, journalists are being exiled, Chepe has been in jail for almost a year, and you know, an election year is coming up, so how would you approach it, as there are a few people willing to report, newsrooms are not being helpful to its reporters, and the public is not really trusting the media? Thank you.
Easy question, Jodie.
With caution, I think, is the answer. So, as you say, it's incredibly difficult and challenging to report out of Guatemala at the moment, as it is in many countries in the region and globally. And people need to be aware of their own risks. As Masha said, you need to understand and make decisions for yourself about the level of risk that you are prepared to take, and know before you go in or before you report from anywhere what that is, and make sure that you are prepared for that. Unfortunately, you know, it used to be the case, it's less now, that people would sort of see a region and feel that they wanted to go out there and report on it with little understanding of what risks that was presenting, both for them but also the individuals who would then be called on to support them when they're there. That's changing a little, but really understanding the risks inherent in any country or any area that you're reporting on is the first way to be able to report on what's happening.
I mean, I think one key thing is journalist solidarity. Journalists have to band together. They have to be together against this fight for their rights and for democracy, because no single news organization can do it alone. You need sort of an infrastructure to support press freedom, and that requires not just journalists, that requires media lawyers, that requires a supportive public, and every element of civil society that can come and support the work that journalists do, even by just buying newspapers or contributing to a news organization. We can't do this alone.
Hi,
Yes,
my name is Cece. So, like, Republican states are increasingly promoting legislation that attacks the LGBTQ rights as, like, more of defensive, like we're just protecting children, or a return to that golden age. How can journalists, or is it possible for journalists to report objectively without being complicit in promoting that narrative?
Masha, I think this question was made for you.
Okay. I'm just going to mark the word objectively as problematic. I think journalists should report deeply. I think journalists should have a critical perspective on their sourcing and framing. This is true of every journalistic enterprise, right? But we're talking about this particular case of the coverage of anti-trans laws and trans issues in general, that there's a reason why it's so explosive, right? It's a new social issue. The language and narratives that we're dealing with are still being developed. They're unfamiliar to many people in the audience, and they're unfamiliar to many journalists. So a journalist's first job, and this is where a lot of people who have covered trans issues fall down on the job immediately, is to find people who are experts in the narratives and the issues, right? And not just to go out there and say, they say this, and these other people say that, and then also forget that there's a third side and a fourth side and a fifth side, right? So get well-versed, dedicate yourself to covering these issues. These laws are pending in half the states. It's not a one-off thing. There should be newsrooms that can afford to should have 1 or 2 people on this beat, right? And then after a few weeks, they start becoming well versed, right? And then every time they write a story, they have to question whether the framing is received from one side.
Hi, I'm Mariana Lehman. I'm also a graduate of the school, and like Jodie, I was paying attention to what was not being said or the voices that were absent from the discussion. And it was only 30 minutes into the discussion that Latin America came up. And I am from Brazil, so I appreciate the challenges of putting together a panel, scheduling and such. But it's not only here at this stage, but I think Latin America gets very little attention. And I wonder if it's because of what Jodie said, if it's because of guns and because the threat of war is coming from other places of the world, and you don't see any emerging military power there, or is it a matter of the volume of trade, or like why is Latin America pretty much absent from the coverage and from people's minds in general?
It's a really good question, and so it's interesting. When I moved to the States, I always assumed that the lack of Latin America coverage in the UK was because we're not Spanish speaking or Portuguese speaking. So I sort of assumed that was that. And actually, now I'm here, I think it is a broader challenge. And we at the Committee to Protect Journalists talk a lot in particular about the high number of killings in places like Mexico, for example, but getting attention for that, although there was an excellent piece in the New Yorker recently about Mexico and the killings of journalists, getting attention for that is really challenging. And I think part of that is frankly to do with the fact that people's attention spans are quite limited on international things, and so they can generally cope with about one major crisis, and at the moment that crisis is Ukraine. And if, in fact, when I talk to journalists, a high number of journalists remain in exile from Afghanistan who feel utterly, utterly abandoned. And they've been abandoned twice over because they were frankly abandoned by the United States in terms of the evacuation, and now their story is not being told. And I think in part that is because I think people's ability, including editors' ability, to sort of hold attention on a number of stories is limited, and Ukraine currently sucks up. These guys are active journalists, so they may have a different view, but it feels like editors and so on have the capacity for kind of 1 or 2 crises at a time.
Right. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Dorian Ben Coyle. I teach a course here.
Hi, Dorian.
Hi, Sheila. This is a question primarily for you, Masha. Gessen, but certainly, Sheila, you'd be qualified to answer too. You talked about the need for courage. Russia is known for taking retribution against those who report vigorously about Russia, even outside its borders. What is your source of courage? Where do you get that courage from?
I don't feel qualified to talk about courage, and I'm not being I'm not exhibiting false modesty. I just think that there's a proportionality here, right? I'm not there. And certainly being in Russia now is more dangerous than being in Ukraine for journalists. Right? I also think that I write for the New Yorker. I've won awards. And when sort of prominence, for the most part, not always, right? Prominence protects people. When you look at the list, the CPJ list of murdered journalists, many of them were not well known. Most of them, I think, were not well known. When the eyes of the world are not on you, you're in more danger than when they are, right? And you know, even if it's a fairly small world, as in the world of journalism. So you know, the question I think to me is like, where do these people who are in Russia working anonymously get their courage? Like, this boggles my mind, and I don't have an answer to your question.
Thank you.
I have friends who've been killed in the Philippines, and I also don't know where they get the courage. And also, like, there's this friend of mine, who's a journalist from a small town in southern Philippines, and she'd been receiving death threats, and yet she went on and on with it. And when I'd see her, she'd always be well-dressed, made up, and she'd tell me, you know, I want to look good when they come and get me. You know, she had this kind of, I don't know where it is, but it's there. And there are so many journalists all around the world whose names we don't know, who are doing this every day, risking their lives so that they can tell you what is happening in their little corner of the world.
Can I just say something about this? That, yes, it's absolutely true. There are hundreds of journalists going into incredibly difficult situations with no sense that it's for glory or for a byline. And they don't, in the most part, and this is what I find astonishing, they wouldn't even recognize the word courage. The vast majority, when I speak to them, just feel that they're doing their job, that it's absolutely essential to report the truth because that's what people deserve. They're just doing their job day after day, and they're prepared, and they believe that it is so important that people have access to that truth that they're willing to risk their lives, but they don't see it as courage.
Hi, my name is Sheila. I'm a trans journalist from India and currently enrolled in the MA program here. The thing that I want to talk about or ask you is that sometimes the crackdown on press freedom is not absolute. It's almost indirect, where there are police summons or income tax raids or just false charges. So in those cases, who should we turn to, and what are some of the resources available for journalists like me who are either starting out in a new country or want to go back and report on the issues that are underreported in my country and almost nobody talks about them?
I could say that. I mean, we've actually just produced a guide called Know Your Rights for India, intended to help freelance journalists in particular who don't have access to the lawyers that you might have in a large newsroom understand that. We also, and I know a number of other organisations do, but CPJ also has an emergencies department where people can ring and ask for support. So if you did find yourself receiving legal threats or other kinds of threats, we can also provide advice. So there are organisations like the Committee to Protect Journalists and others who provide that kind of service. Unfortunately, the challenge is the problems are getting, we are seeing more and more of these kinds of attacks in more and more places on more and more journalists. So, and I think that's likely to continue while we have this democratic crisis.
So I think on that note, we'll end this panel. I'd like to thank Jodie and Masha.
Thank you,
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Masha, Jodie, and Sheila. That was great.